sure. So yeah, today this afternoon we're going to dive back down into the actual data simulation and what we do to create these reanalyses. And in my talk in particularly, I'm going to talk about work that I've done over the past year or so to try to improve upon the prototype that's published in ACMNOL 2016, mostly with respect to the improved proxy database and also the proxy system modeling. So this is work that myself and the entire LMR development team at the University of Washington, but also contributions from all of these people, and particularly with respect to the proxy database. So as a general theme in the data simulation world, there are really many important components to this, but two of them are the actual observations that you assimilate and how you model these observations. So I'm going to be talking about this. So in terms of our improvements, proxies were a big part of it. In our initial prototype reanalysis, we used the Pages 2K Phase 1 data that was published in 2013. We have since moved on to the Pages 2K Phase 2 that was recently published earlier this year. But on top of that, also, we have other records that are under testing currently, including the Brighton-Moser tree ring widths that Caleb has worked, and also what I call the NCDC Caleb collection that is also in our database. But what I'll be presenting today is all based on our use of the Pages Phase 2, which is really like the cornerstone of our database right now. Another aspect to this is also improvements to our proxy modeling. What I mean by that is still in the context of these statistical observation models that we've improved upon the univariate annual against temperature that we use for our prototype. And in terms of these updates, what I mean by this, there are two things. Taking better into account the seasonality of these proxy records in our proxy system models, in terms of refining over the annual averaging that we were doing previously. Because we know that these proxies are, seasonal records, and that applies to all of the proxies, essentially. But we also try to improve upon our modeling of, particularly for the trees, because we know that some of them are more temperature sensitive and some are more moisture sensitive. Can we exploit that information in a greater detail than we were previously on the basis of the univariate? And so the whole context of this work is to try, given that setup, how best can we do to identify a candidate for our configuration that we're going to use to generate the reanalysis that we're going to distribute to you guys. So by any means, I'm trying to pitch this as this is the end of the line. This is the drop the mic moment. Let's turn off the lights. We're done. This is just to establish a clear baseline, a new null hypothesis upon which all other future improvements will have to compare against. So keep that in mind. So, for that, I've generated a lot of different reconstructions using our offline ensemble data simulation technique. I'm not going to go into details about this because Andre is going to talk next, and he's going to give you all the details about what this means is offline versus online. I've reconstructed numerous fields that covers the whole common era, using, like I said, the Pages 2K Phase 2 proxies, only the proxies that were annual and sub-annual proxy records. For our prior, I used the CCSM before last Millennium simulation. Seems to be the one that works best. And also, all of the results that I'm going to talk to you about today were proxy system models, or statistical proxy system models that were calibrated against the GISTEMP instrumental temperature product. I'm going to use ensemble sizes of varying from 100 to 200, mostly 100. And I'm going to withhold proxies, and all of my do reconstructions multiple times in which I withheld a certain part of proxy database and set aside to do later verification. And using this, these ensemble members are randomly drawn from that last Millennium ensemble. So I can do that multiple times. So each time I do this, I use a different set of members of states that are populate my ensemble. So you can expect a slightly different flavor from every time you do these reconstructions. So you can sample multiple times over these differences using a Monte Carlo iterations approach, using these random samples. And what I'm done so far is 50 times of these realizations, 50 times of these 100 ensemble members. So in terms of sample for verification, it's order of 50,000 reconstructions. So it's quite significant. So there's going to be different flavors. There's going to be actually annual means to populate the state, but to calculate the forward models, we can use the seasonal, appropriate seasonal time averaging. So, and how we're going to evaluate this, essentially, it is essentially what is in the paper, in the 2016 paper to start with, is comparing against all of these instrumental era products, and over which we're going to compare against the consensus over all of these different products, and using our usual verification metrics, including over the global mean temperature, but also gridded verification over the entire globe. But we are going to also go beyond that very temperature 20th century centric verification by verifying in proxy space over these withheld proxies from our experiments. So it's going to tell us something more about not only how we do over the 20th century, but also how well we do pre-instrumental era, comparing against the proxies themselves. So generally, it's how it works. You do a reconstruction over, you take the whole proxy database, you withheld a part of it, you set those aside, you do the reconstructions on the basis of the ones that are simulated, and then you can compare against using, again, the proxy system models to propagate the information back in the proxy space and compare against your estimate based on the reconstruction against the actual signal from the record itself, and then you can calculate all of these, again, verification metrics. So first, in terms of the proxy database, so we started from this is from our prototype reanalysis in terms of the spatial distribution of the records that were used, and in terms of the temporal distribution of the records that were assimilated. And now we've moved on to here with about 80 more records that we assimilate. Particularly, the tropical coral is much more well distributed across the tropics. That's probably the most improvements. All the tree rings are still here. We have more tree ring wood density, much more than we did in the phase one, which Greg showed yesterday that it has a large impact on the results. And also, again, in the temporal distribution, it's relatively the same. It's a little bit more here. The top here is 500, here is 600, but you have a flavor that as we go back in time, the much less proxy records contribute to the reanalysis. And again, the trees dominate the whole, in terms of numbers, dominate the whole reanalysis. So just to give you a flavor of these verification, on the left here is what was in the for the prototype, and what we obtain now on the right here from the new database when we do the same reconstruction on the basis of the same configuration. What we see here basically is a slight deterioration in terms of the annual verifications over the 20th century against the consensus here, going from 91 correlation to and 79 CE to a 93 correlation and a 61 CE. So a slight deterioration, most of it due to that part here, which seems to be colder reconstruction using the new proxy records. Both of these experiments were, in terms of the proxy system models that we used, were the same in the sense that they were annually averaged, univariate against temperature, calibrated against GIST temps in both of these scenarios. So, but that's not the entire story. This is against the global mean temperature on the annual, for the interannual. If you look at the detrended verification, you actually see an uptick in the verification statistics with the new database from 71 to 74 and 0.32 to 0.41. So an improvement again upon the interannual variability beyond the trend that we see during the 20th century. And also in terms of the spatial verification, one measure that we use is the anomaly correlations again, that we can compare against the 20th century reanalyses and also against the instrumental GIST temperature product. Again, here we see a positive impact of using the updated database. We have a better verification, essentially, in terms of the patterns that are represented in the analyses compared to these instrumental era products. From 0.25 on the mean correlation, anomaly correlations, we bump up to about 0.29. So the first figure that I showed you is not the entire story. There's slight deterioration with respect to the global mean temperature in terms of the trend, mostly. However, using the new database, we have an improved, in some way, reconstructions in terms of the interannual variability and also the spatial verification. So we're going to move now to slightly a little bit longer story about the PSMs, or the statistical PSM that we've been using, which are still regression-based. There are definitely, from a practical perspective, not a scientific perspective, but from a practical perspective, there are definitely some advantages of using those. One of which is ease of implementation. It's really easy to do. You can apply them to all the proxies. You don't have to worry about specificities in the proxy records, which units they are from, which type of measurements they were. You just regress against a reference calibration data set. You don't have to worry about these things. You also can have a realistic, we think, estimate of the observation error that is associated with every of these records by exploiting the residuals that come out of the regressions, would tell you something about how well the proxy is correlating to that calibration data set. And we actually, the infamous R term in our Kalman update actually comes from the mean square error of the residuals from the regression. So we have that for free, essentially, by doing that technique. And we also avoid some problems that might be related to threshold that some of these more fancy models are using. We are, as Nathan and Sylvia have shown in their paper, there can be some disadvantage to moving to a more mechanistic-based PSM compared to these linear regression models. However, that being said, there are also some limitation and caveats that you need to be aware of. Particularly, one of them is you cannot calibrate all the proxies that you have, because if there is no overlap with valid data in the calibration data set, you cannot have a PSM built for that record, therefore you cannot assimilate it. You're also subject to, whenever you do regressions, you have to be careful about what you're doing, particularly when you're dealing with small samples of a noisy signal. You can have funky things in there as well. You can be, since we're using a calibration data set that also has its own quirks, you also import these deficiencies into your proxy system model as well. There might be some questions about a proxy system model that you build over the 20th century. Is it valid for earlier period? Which are all valid questions, but we'll see how we, despite these limitations, let's see how we can do. Again, like I said, this is not the end of the line. This is only to really clearly establish a benchmark over which future work will have to compare against. So again, keep that in mind. So one of the things, like I said, one aspect of this is to import seasonal, to build these proxy system models that are seasonal, essentially, rather than using a predictor that is an annual average. So let's average it over the appropriate seasonal period for that proxy record. And we have information about this seasonality for every of these records. So what I'm going to be testing are two options, one of which is using the actual metadata that's encoded in the database. For every proxy record, there is information about which season this proxy represents. I'm going to be using this information to build my regression model over the appropriate season for the predictor. Also, I'm going to use a more objective, what I call objective method, is where I'm building these regressions over multiple possible seasonalities of these records. I'm taking the naive approach of, I don't know what a seasonality is. Let's try and figure out what it is. On the basis of these regressions on the calibration data set. So I'm testing over multiple possible seasonalities, and I'm picking the one that actually gives me the best fit to the calibration data. But also be in mind that in my search of this seasonality, I'm using also the one that's in the metadata. So to not rule it out as one of the best possible seasonality. But also I'm adding other ones, such as annual, as we were doing before, and others, such as appropriate summertime, wintertime, spring, summer, whatever combinations that you can think of. So there are two options for the seasonality. Just to give you an example of how this might affect the regression itself, here I'm showing for a particular wood density record in Scandinavia, I believe. This is what we were using before on the annual basis. This is what we obtain when we use the seasonality of the metadata. And this is the one we obtain when we do the objective fit. So as you can see from the annual, and so this is the scatter plot for the regression, but also here in blue is the actual proxy record that we're trying to calibrate. And in red is the actual model time series that we obtain on the basis of the calibration data set itself, just to give you a visual. But as you can see, you increase your coherence between the actual data. You increase the slope of your linear model, leading you to think that you're going to have a more impact on the reanalysis. The other thing is also this parameter here, which is the one where we're using as the uncertainty, the variance of the error in the data simulation. This value changes quite a bit, decreasing actually, leading, which will lead to a more weight of that proxy in the analysis. So just to give you a visual of how this might affect your results in terms of the PSMs themselves. So here now some verification statistics over the 20th century, different metrics. Here is the annual global mean temperature correlation, the coefficient of efficiency, similar thing but over the detrended temperature, the mean anomaly correlations that we get, and also gridded, grid point by grid point, but taking the mean over the global mean over the verification statistics for the correlation and the CE. For the different flavors of the reconstructions that we get from the prototype, so that's the V1 reconstruction that we got. This is moving towards the updated database, but still doing the proxy system modeling on an annual basis. Seasonal with the metadata, and seasonal, the objective seasonal results in the red here. Basically across the board, as you can see, you obtain better results by using the seasonal objective method here. These are all still univariate against temperature. Keep that in mind. So that's one aspect of this. Another aspect is to try to move away from the univariate perspective, particularly for the trees, and trying to have system models or proxy system models that take into account both temperature and moisture sensitivities in these records. Two things, one of which is what I call temperature or moisture, where it's still a univariate model, but I'm trying to determine, is it a temperature or is it a moisture record? Again, on the basis of statistics from the fit to the calibration data. So that's one aspect. As a note, using this method, there's about 40% of the trees that are in the Pages phase 2 that were thought to be moisture sensitive rather than temperature sensitive. Another aspect of this is the bivariate approach, where you don't try to decide, you actually do the full problem, quote unquote, where you do a bilinear regression using temperature and moisture within your model. And I should note here that in terms of going back to the seasonalities, using a model like this, you can also, by using the objective seasonality determination, you can actually try to decouple the seasonalities between the temperature and the moisture. So if I use the metadata seasonality, which is a single piece of information, the only thing I can do is apply that seasonality to both temperature and moisture. However, here, by doing the objective method, I can try to decouple this and determine what is the seasonality for temperature and what is the seasonality for moisture by testing over different possibilities with respect to the seasonality for temperature and moisture, and testing over all possible combinations. And the interesting thing is a lot of the tree records actually calibrate against summer temperature and previous winter moisture, which I think I learned that from Julien, which is the thing you might want in your seasonal models. Again, you use the ones that you find which give you the best fit for the seasonalities. As a note, I'm using for the moisture here calibration data set, I'm using the GPCC precipitation product, which seemed to work relatively well. And here are the results. Again, the same metrics. In a nutshell, long story short, the bivariate seasonal objectives seem to give us the best results across the board, at least in some metrics. There's no deterioration. The results are similar across the different configurations. But with respect to particularly the one we're very interested in is the detrended global mean temperature CE, which we have an uptick on the verification metrics if you use that PSM. Another thing we looked at is to try to adjust the covariance localization. Here I'm showing a picture that actually was trying to figure out a cool picture last night of an illustration of what this covariance looks like. It is actually a figure that Nathan produced, like I think a few years ago, which I found on the internet. So I was quite surprised. But so that's what it looks like in terms of, it's a spatial-based weighing function where you're going to limit the influence of a proxy that's located over here. You're going to limit the influence it may have in the far field in terms of its impact. And we have a knob in the data set now where you can play with this radius, either increase or decrease really easily. So you can run a bunch of experiments using different localization radius. And this is what I'm showing here from a relatively short localization radius in the light blue here, 5,000 kilometers, all the way up to 25,000 kilometers, and compared to the one that we use most of our experiments, which is the no localization at all. Again, the sweet spot seems to be in that range here, somewhere between 20, 25 in some of the metrics. Sometimes it's a little bit mixed bag, but overall, going for something like 25 seems reasonable. All right, I'm almost done. And so to just also provide more of a spatial view. This is what we had before in terms of spatial verification for correlation and CE against the 20th century reanalysis against Gestemp. And we had obviously identified what we thought were problematic regions over the continental North America and Asia. But now, with the new PSMs, with the new configuration, given the different proxy records, given the different PSMs that we are now using, we are improving upon this. By any means, it's perfect, but there's an improvement there. Over North America, over Asia, also in the Northern Europe. So overall, the picture is positive. A lot of the little problem areas seem to be decreasing. There is still room for improvement. So whenever you're thinking of mechanistic PSMs, whatnot, these might be the regions you might want to focus on and looking how to improve upon these results. And also the proxy verification perspective here is a lot of information on that plot. Up here is the fit in terms of correlation and coefficient of efficiencies for the assimilated proxies for two different periods. One of which in blue is the calibration period, and in red is the one that is outside the calibration period. So from 0 to 1879. So this is what we were getting for the V1, and this is what we're getting now. So I'm going to flip between one of the two. So you can see definitely the improvement over the quality of the fit to the proxies. The ones that were assimilated and the ones that were withheld from assimilation. So these were not assimilated from the prototype, from our new results. So improvements upon temperature reconstruction over the 20th century. But beyond that, improvements in the reconstructions from the perspective of proxy, so in proxy space, also during the 20th century, but also previous to that calibration period. So this is quite powerful, I think, in looking at that problem from that perspective. All right, so where we are now, so that's the status. Significant improvements to the temperature reconstruction. So I realized that this verification was very much focused on temperature. From my perspective, this is the one we need to get right to start with, and then move beyond for looking at other variables. We have looked at other variables, such as 500 hectopascal heights. There were also improvements that I've not shown here that are more modest. But also, we need to focus more, and I'm speaking to myself here when I say this, we need, given Nathan's and Michael's talks yesterday, we need to pay more attention to the hydroclimate variables as well and see where the improvements are. And all right, so this is actually represents what we think is now the candidate configuration for the production for the reanalysis production that will be distributed, is using the Pages Phase 2 data, using these seasonal objective PSMs. Bivariate temperature moisture for the tree ring widths seems to be providing some improvements. Ensemble sizes between 100 and 200 seems reasonable. And also seems that the covariance localization also seems to be providing some positive influence to the reconstruction as well. So I'm going to stop here, entertain a few questions if you have any.